Hey everybody, Mr. Duker back again, super simplified social studies, and today talking about the home front during World War II. So World War II is a world war, and it's fought in many different places all around the globe. You have the Eastern fronts in Europe, right? You have the Western front with England and United States against Germany. You got the Pacific front or the theater where the war against Japan is being fought. And then you also have the home front, the war being fought at home. World War II is a total war. It took everybody contributing, all hands on deck. Just because you weren't a soldier overseas didn't mean you didn't participate and help to win the war. As a matter of fact, the only way those soldiers were going to be able to win was with the help and support of everybody back home doing everything they can to give them the resources needed to win the war. So when we say the home front, again, it's the war being fought at home. Like always, I'm getting ahead of myself. So like I just said, the war was very massive, required everybody to contribute and everybody to make sacrifices, right? Again, just because you weren't fighting overseas doesn't mean that you can't help. Everybody back home at this time contributed, chipped in to help for a lot of reasons, as we'll see, but it required a lot of sacrifices. People had to do a little more and maybe go without a little less. But by doing this, right, by everyone chipping in, it kind of helped out, right? Everybody thought that they were helping and pitching in, and everyone was on the same team. It made it feel like you were contributing and you're working towards a larger goal. There's a lot more unity, a lot more patriotism, because we're all in this together, right? If we lose this war, we may not have our freedoms in our country anymore. So again, it really brought people close together by having some of these shared experiences. Everybody, again, rationing and sacrificing. It really kind of helped bring the country together by chipping in at home. So many ways that Americans would try and help out, and a big one was by rationing, right? Basically, the soldiers overseas, they had priority. They needed all the resources they could to fight the war. So that meant they needed all the food so they would never go hungry, right? We don't want our soldiers to be starving. All the things that the military needs, like gasoline and ammunition to fight in the war. Resources and materials like steel and iron and rubber and gas and fabric and nylon and medicine, chocolate and cigarette. I mean, everything had to go to the troops. And so what that meant is people back home had to do with a little bit less, right? Sacrifice at home so the soldiers had more while they're on the battlefield. So rationing is what we call it. And there were many ways they would try and do this, right? What they ended up doing is giving everybody what are called ration stamps or ration books. If you see the little stickers with the tanks on there, those are ration stamps. And so what happened now is when you went to the store to go shopping, everything had two prices, right? You had to pay for things in money. Some people are wealthier than others, so people with more money you would think would be able to buy more stuff. But to make sure that everybody only got their fair share, everything also had a second cost. It cost a certain amount of ration stamps. So when you go to the checkout counter, you pay for your milk, your cheese, and your eggs, right? Each one of those had a different cost in ration stamps depending on how badly it was needed, right? So things like meat were very expensive, right? If you splurged your ration stamps, and you may have to spend like half of your book, right, to go get pork chops or something like that for dinner tonight, that's fine. But then, you wouldn't have any stamps for dinner the rest of the week, or you couldn't afford that meat. Does that make sense? So the whole idea was to put kind of an artificial limit on what people could buy. And so people at home had to be very crafty and careful with their ration stamp budget, right? And making those stamps last as long as they could. Because again, when you were out of stamps, again, you could be wealthy. You couldn't buy anything anymore. You had to wait till your next stamp booklet came out. So you kind of had to conserve and be crafty and smart with how you use the stamps so you wouldn't run out and to make sure you could feed your family, right? So ration stamps. Also, like I said, everything else was rationed as well. Gasoline, trying to get Americans to drive less so you could send more gas to the troops in the field. Cars, they didn't really, we'll get to that, but, they weren't really making a lot of cars at this time. So your old jalopy, keep it running. That was kind of rationing, so, make it last longer. The clothing you wore, right? Instead of going out and buying new clothing, just try and patch up and repair and keep wearing the old ones you had. Just finding new uses for the old materials you had, because what we don't want people is going to the store, buying a lot of stuff stuff that we needed to send to the troops overseas. Some examples here. This woman here, very famous actress from the time, Rita Hayworth, I think is her name. But here, and many people would do this, they would take the bumpers off their cars because that was kind of scrap metal, as we'll see, and that was something you would ration. You need a lot of metal and steel, so taking the bumpers off the car so you could use that metal to make weapons, right? Or driving slow. Don't go crazy when you're driving to save the wear and tear on your tires. Make your tires last longer so you don't need to get them replaced as often, right? So that means that all the other tires we make can, again, go to the troops fighting overseas. So like I said, everything was rationed. Chocolate, coffee, sugar, flour, meat, eggs, potatoes, tires, gas. It was all saved so the troops, again, would have enough stuff to fight. Another way that you could get around rationing then, what were called victory gardens, right? So you only had so many stamps to get food. What happens if you have like a big family or a big appetite or you're just really hungry? Well, there's nothing saying you can't grow food at home. And so many people would do that, and they would plant what were called victory gardens. It's just a home garden. But the idea was, instead of doing like flowers and stuff, you would plant vegetables, carrots, potatoes, radishes, tomatoes, peppers, whatever. And then that was extra food that you could keep, right? And to make it last, you could can it, like that woman in the poster there, kind of preserving that food, put it in the pantry. So maybe in a couple months, if times are tough or you just needed some extra food, you had it available. Building up a stockpile of food. Hey, we know what that's about now, right? So you have it for later. And this was a patriotic thing to do. Many Americans would do this, and it didn't matter where. Wherever you had room, people would plant victory gardens. So in the front yard by your sidewalk, right? Or your old flower bed. Dig that up and plant some veggies. In your kitchen, on the windowsill, right on the counter. Get some pots and then plant some veggies in there to get some extra food for you to eat. So again, it was very patriotic in a way. Americans, an easy, simple way they could help win the war by growing their own food. Scrap drives was mentioned in that previous photo, but recycling was a big thing, right? And so you would gather up all the old scrap metal like people do today, like recycling cans and stuff like that. But there's a lot of scrap metal from like old toys, old tools. We saw that woman with the bumpers before. Any scrap metal you could find, collect it, turn it into the recycling center. They could melt it down and then reuse that for weapons, for bullets and vehicles and stuff like that. And so this was a popular pastime for children. This was something that they could do. They want to try and help out. So they would go around the neighborhood on scrap metal drives, and they would pride themselves on being able to, hop some fences or go into the garage and find any old piece of metal and then turn that in to be reused for weapons, right? So scrap drives is just basically recycling metals for the war. War bonds is huge. Wars are expensive, and the government can only pay for so much. And so one way they helped pay for the war, pay for these weapons, pay for the ammo, pay for the gas, pay for the food, the uniforms, the medicine, all that stuff were war bonds. So a war bond is basically a loan you give to the government. So a lot of Americans were working at this time, but there's not a lot of places to spend your money, as we saw, because of rationing. So your extra that extra money in your paycheck, instead of just having it sit in the bank doing nothing, instead you would loan it to the government in what's called a bond, right? So a bond, it's like an IOU, right? Hey, here's $50. The government gives you a piece of paper back, which basically says, thanks for the money. Keep this paper, and in, I don't know, 20 years, we'll pay you back the $50 plus interest. So an extra $10 or $15 on top of what you gave us. So it was a way kind of to make money. It was an investment. As long as your country exists, they'll pay you back later. But the Americans raised a ton of money from the war with bonds. You can see here about $135 billion was given to the government with bond money. And this was also a very patriotic thing to do. Some people would donate their whole paychecks, and they would pride themselves on that, giving everything they could to end the war as quickly as possible. Sometimes you'd have bond drives where like a town would set a goal, like a fundraising goal. Hey, this weekend we want to raise, I don't know, $80,000 as a town. If we do that, that would be enough to buy a tank, to buy a plane, right? And you can see right here, people would do that. They would turn out, donate some money, get your picture in front of a tank, kind of, make it kind of fun. And, you would have whole, like I said, towns chipping in to pay for weapons. And they would kind of sponsor, a tank, a plane, a Jeep, whatever. Sometimes you would have heroes from the war come back home, and they would go on tour speaking to people about what the war was like and how they were helping and, what your bond money was doing to win the war. And, people would come out and see them as well. It was an event. It was something to do on the weekends. But it was very important to help pay for this expensive war, chipping in with your paycheck with war bonds. The big thing is that really, really helped win the war was American industry, right? So if you remember, right before World War II, we had the Great Depression, high unemployment, lots of people not working, factories closed. It was bad economic times. And even though, FDR and the New Deal tried to help, it really didn't end the Great Depression. It's World War II that ends the Great Depression. And so right away when the war begins, the United States got a lot of catching up to do. This is a statistic I like to point out, but when I think 1941, when Pearl Harbor was attacked, right? Romania, not the lettuce, the country of Romania, a small European nation, actually had a bigger military than the United States. We were very unprepared during the Great Depression. We kind of let the military linger a little bit. We needed a lot of weapons to catch up to fight this war against Japan and Germany. And so overnight, these factories come back to life, start making weapons. And throughout the rest of the war, this is like one of the best things the United States does. We've become very good at just mass producing everything we needed, but our allies needed for the war as well. And these factories never shut down, right? Day and night, 24/7, we were just turning out weapons for the war. 3 shifts. You had the morning shift, the afternoon shift, and the night shift. And it is just mind-boggling just how much stuff the United States makes. And this is why we were able to win the war. We just made a lot more weapons than our enemies could ever hope to blow up or to sink. And, America is far away from the war. We got 2 oceans to protect us, so these factories don't have to really worry about being attacked or bombed. And so they could just go full blast, turning out weapons, and America becomes what they call the arsenal of democracy, right? Making weapons, again, for us, for our allies like the Soviets and England, and basically becoming giant arms dealer, if you think of it that way, just turning out tons of weapons to win the war. You could not win the war without American factories. How much stuff? A ton of stuff. So during the war, the United States, you can see there, 88,000 tanks are made during the war. Almost 2.5 million trucks, many of which went to the Soviet Union because they couldn't really make their own. They had to make they had to make weapons of their own. They didn't have room for truck factories, so we sent them trucks. Almost 100,000 fighters and 100,000 bombers were made during the war. During the war, this is another little fun fact. If you like cars, right? This kind of is mind-blowing to me. During the war from 1942 to 1945, right? So during that period of World War II, not a single car was made in the United States during this time. Let me say that again. No cars were made during World War II. What does that mean? There are no 44 Fords, right? 45 Chevys, they don't exist. Why? Because car factories were all making weapons during the war, right? So General Motors made tanks and airplane engines. Ford made bombers in their factories. Everybody was making weapons, even other smaller businesses, right? If you made appliances like toasters or radios or refrigerators, well, you were making guns. You were making ammunition, right? You were making, I don't know, radiators or something like that. Everybody was making weapons, and we made a ton of them during the war. It's just, again, crazy just how much stuff we were making, which we very much needed. Now, who's working in these factories? All the men, most of the men, are overseas fighting. And so it's also during this time in World War II, you see a lot of women and minorities kind of really step up and take on those jobs that traditionally were held for men. And so this is where the I don't want to say the myth, but the persona of Rosie the Riveter comes from, right? Women stepped up huge and became welders and riveters and electricians, right? Mechanics, pilots, and they went into those factories and did those, again, traditional jobs that were held by men, did them just as well. And they were working those long shifts, making all those weapons for the men, you know, their boyfriends, their husbands, their sons to be fighting with in the war. And so couldn't have done it without them because the manpower was all overseas, right? So that's Rosie the Riveter. Rosie is kind of, like I said, a mythical American hero, right? There's a couple women that were like, you know, I was Rosie, or Rosie's kind of like me, but I kind of think of Rosie as like a Paul Bunyan, right? A Johnny Appleseed, John Henry. These are kind of mythical kind of American heroes from the past that symbolized an industry or symbolized the type of person who was working at that time. You know, Paul Bunyan is kind of like symbolizes American lumberjacks, right? Who went into the woods and you know, worked in the lumber industry. John Henry, all the people who built the railroads, right? Johnny Appleseed, well, he just plants apple trees. But Rosie's kind of like that, right? This idea of, you know, strong, powerful woman embodies all working women during this time. And you know, they're still moms. They still got to go home and take care of the kids and cook dinner and pay the bills on top of working, you know, 10-hour shifts 6 days a week. So they definitely chipped in and helped, but they were able to get good paying jobs, get out of the home, get into the workforce, and again, really, really helped to win the war. And again, minorities too. Jobs that traditionally maybe weren't available to, you know, African Americans, Hispanics and stuff. They too got really good paying jobs and proved they're able to work just as well as anybody else and really did their part to help win the war too on the American home front. All right, so that is it today. Hopefully that made a little bit more sense. Hopefully that was a little bit more clear. And, you know, everyone chipped in to participate. It was, again, all hands on deck in World War II. Kids, women, minorities, everybody chipping in. Everybody had something to do to help win the war. It's the only way you're going to win this war at the time. So, again, Mr. Duker, Super Simplified Social Studies. Hopefully that was helpful, and I'll catch you later with another video.